I have never shared a bed with anyone. The trembling confession slipped from Naomi's lips. A small black maid scorned by the whole town of Redstone, clinging to the last scrap of privacy she still owned within the cold, narrow walls of a lodging house. But that snowy night, the door suddenly blew open, carrying the storm with it, and the heavy step of a stranger, a tall man rimmed in frost. He asked for no pity, only a corner to rest until morning. Faced with her helpless refusal, Naomi was forced to speak the most guarded truth of her life. Instead of turning away, the man answered with a steady vow that shook her heart. From this night on, you'll never have to sleep alone again. The lamplight threw their shadows, one fragile, one steadfast, against the wooden wall. And in that storm-torn night, unknown to Redstone, a story had begun that would outlive every whispered rumor. December of 1879 found the town of Redstone swallowed in the grip of a merciless winter's night. Snow piled heavy on rooftops, drifted thick along wooden steps, while the wind howled as if it meant to sweep the little town clear off the map and bury it in white. The main street, once noisy with traders on market days, now lay deserted, broken only by the shriek of wind slipping through cracks in the buildings. A lantern swung from the porch of the Redstone Inn, its weak golden glow flickering against the dense curtain of snow. Inside, Naomi Colter sat behind the front desk. The slight, dark-skinned maid, thin and wiry, busied herself folding linens gathered from the day's work. Her calloused hands, fingers cracked from icy water, moved slowly but with practiced rhythm. Each gesture repeated itself like the dull pattern of her life, long resigned to monotony. From the stove in the corner came the soft crackle of spent logs, pushing back the cold with only a fragile pocket of warmth. Naomi lifted her head, listening to the wind's moan outside. She knew few travelers would arrive tonight. Most had sought shelter before the storm came down. The inn had filled early that evening, and she had helped the keeper settle the last guests into their rooms. For once she thought she might rest, close her eyes after the long day's labor. But just as she reached to snuff the lantern on the desk, the wooden door flew open. A violent gust rushed in, flinging snow across the floor, making the fire in the stove quiver, the light in the room jump. Naomi startled, clutching the frayed shawl tight around her shoulders. A man stepped inside. Tall, broad-shouldered, his coat drenched and heavy with frost. Snow melted in rivulets, spotting the floorboards as he stripped off his gloves and laid them on the counter. His breath came rough and clouded white in the air. Gray eyes fixed on Naomi, neither angry nor pleading, only the weary gaze of someone who had fought his way through miles of storm. Naomi froze. She had grown accustomed to strangers at the inn, traders, hunters, drifting cowboys. But something about this face was different. Exhaustion marked him, yes. Yet behind those eyes lay a steadiness, the look of a man who had weathered storms greater than this one. He set his snow-laden hat on the counter, his voice rough, hoarse with cold. "Please, a room, just for the night." Naomi swallowed hard. She knew well the truth. Every room along the hall was full. She had checked only moments ago. Her fingers clenched the fabric of her skirt before she answered, quiet but clear. "I'm sorry. Every room is taken. We've been full since the afternoon." The man closed his eyes a moment, as though to master his weariness. His dark hair clung damp across his brow. Flecks of snow still caught in his lashes. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of fatigue, yet his gaze remained steady, unbroken. Naomi braced for him to turn away, as countless latecomers had when told the inn was full. But he did not move. Instead, he drew a breath, and his voice, slow and gravelly, cut through the hush. "If there is no room, then may I share yours for the night?" The air in the small room froze. Naomi felt her heartbeat pound against her ribs. The request, plain and direct, stole her breath. All her life she had guarded her one place of privacy. Her bed, an old wooden frame draped with a patched quilt, had been hers alone. The single corner of the world no one else could trespass. And now a stranger asked to cross that threshold. She stepped back, fists tightening on her skirt, throat dry. Yet when she found her voice, it came trembling but steady enough. I have never shared a bed with anyone." The man did not waver. His gray eyes held hers, free of mockery, free of scorn, only tired honesty, and something as firm as a vow. He rested a rough hand on the counter, dipped his head slightly, and answered, "Then from this night on, you'll never have to sleep alone again." Naomi stood frozen. The words rang not as a plea, nor as jest. They came like a quiet promise, cracking the walls she had built so carefully around herself. Her heart trembled, fear tangled with a strange, dangerous hope. The lamplight threw their shadows against the wooden wall. The frail outline of a thin young woman and the towering figure of a stranger rimmed in snow. Outside, the storm raged on, wind shrieking down Redstone's main street. But here, in this flickering silence, Naomi heard only his vow and saw only the steady certainty in his eyes. She did not answer at once. Her breath came fast, hands clenched white. She knew one nod could alter the course of her whole life. And if she refused, perhaps by morning the town would whisper that a stranger had frozen to death, only steps from warmth. The room held its breath. Only the crackle of the stove and the storm beyond broke the stillness. Naomi drew air deep into her lungs, willing her legs to hold steady. In her eyes, fear and longing wrestled, fear of what might come, longing to be seen, if only once. The man waited, patient, unhurried, leaving wet prints across the floorboards. His gaze never left her. Naomi parted her lips, but the words caught. She turned toward the lantern's wavering flame, as though to draw courage from its glow. Inside her mind rose the old voices, sharp as needles. The colored girl from the inn, easy enough for any man. Every slur cut deep, and yet, above them all, his voice echoed fresh and unyielding. "You'll never have to sleep alone again." And Naomi knew. On that snowbound night, a single step would change the road ahead forever. The oil lamp on the counter sputtered and burned, casting a warm golden glow across their faces. Outside, the wind still tore through every crack in the wood, snow pounding heavy on the roof. But inside this narrow room, Naomi felt as if time itself had paused. She nodded slowly, so faintly she almost did not notice it herself. Then she turned, pulling a thicker shawl around her shoulders. "Follow me," she whispered, her voice still trembling, yet steady enough to guide the way. The inn's door swung open again. A rush of cold swept inside, carrying snowflakes that scattered across the floor. Naomi clutched her shawl tighter and stepped quickly out into the storm. The man followed close behind, his boots crunching deep into the drifts. Somewhere in the distance, hooves faded into silence, leaving only their footsteps mingled with the wind's cry. Her home lay not far, yet in the biting dark it stretched longer than ever. Houses lined the street, shutters drawn tight, faint strips of light slipping through narrow curtains. No one watched. No one knew the risk she was taking. And with each step, Naomi felt as if she were breaking an unseen chain, no longer just the colored maid from the inn, but a woman leading a stranger into her one private space. At the edge of town, she stopped, turning toward her small house. Her eyes flickered, half wary, half inviting. The latch lifted with a creak, the door groaning open, and cold air rushed in. Inside, only a few coals glowed faintly in the stove. The room was plain. A rickety wooden bed draped in a patchwork quilt, a small table, a faded cloth shelf. Nothing of value, save for the order Naomi kept through the years. Tonight, for the first time, another breath would join hers inside it. Naomi knelt quickly at the stove, feeding it new logs. Flames leapt up, throwing light across the stranger's face. He lowered himself onto the chair, tugging off soaked gloves, breath heavy but eyes fixed on her awkward movements. She set an old kettle to heat. The scent of burning wood mixed with the sharp cold still clinging to his coat. Her hand shook as she lifted a cracked clay cup, poured hot water, and set it before him without meeting his gaze. Never before had she poured for a man seated inside her own home. Colter took it, drinking slowly, his expression calm. He spoke no further, as if silence itself was enough. Naomi heard the swallow of his throat, the rush of her own breath. Every small sound weighted heavy in the narrow room. It was not the storm that pressed against her chest, but a new sensation entirely, the presence of a man. When he set the cup down, Naomi's fingers trembled. She moved toward the bed, brushing the quilt she knew so well. Yet tonight it seemed strange, foreign. It was no longer hers alone. Her heart pounded fast, caught between fear and anticipation. But Colter did not press closer. He lay on one edge, leaving a clear space between them. No suggestion, no bold advance, only a steady presence, quiet and firm. Naomi slipped onto the far side, turning her face toward the wall. The winter night thickened. The wind rattled outside, and inside the little house, 2 heavy breaths filled the dark. Eyes wide open, Naomi stared at the wooden wall. All her life she had fallen asleep to the lonely beat of her own heart. Tonight, for the first time, that rhythm was joined by another, so close she could not sleep for listening. She clutched the quilt tight, the warmth reaching her across the narrow space. The distance still held, but it was enough. Enough to know she was no longer alone. In the dark, her lips parted as if to whisper something, but no sound came. The words unspoken lingered in the room, leaving their mark like a quiet seal, an opening into another life, a second breath joining her once empty bed. Outside, snow fell harder. The wind struck the windows with force. Yet within, Naomi understood. This night had changed her room forever. For the first time, it held more than her own breath, and that alone was enough to make her whole world tremble, fragile though it was. Naomi Carter had long grown used to being a shadow in other people's eyes. Each morning she rose before all others, stoking the fire while dawn still lay gray upon the town, wiping the dust from window panes, scrubbing linens caked with the mud of passing travelers. By night, when the last lamp on the street was snuffed out, she was still bent over the floor, washing away the day's stains. The work at the Redstone Inn was never light. Yet even when she did the labor of 2, no one remembered her name. To strangers on the road, She was nothing more than a maid who passed briefly across their vision. To the townsfolk, she was less than that. A dark figure drifting through a hallway. They did not call her Naomi. They whispered, sometimes low enough for her to catch, sometimes not caring to hide it at all. The colored girl from the inn. That name clung to her like a tag she could never peel away. At first, Naomi fought it. Each time she heard the murmur, she tried to lift her chin high, hoping her steady gaze might unsettle them. But it never did. They only smirked, turned away, leaving another scratch across her heart. So Naomi learned endurance. She folded her anger tight, tucked it away with the old dresses in the wooden trunk inside her little house at the end of the street. Outside, she wore silence like armor. Sometimes silence was the only shield a woman like her could carry. From behind the front desk, she would watch couples enter laughing, hear merchants trading stories, see men slapping each other's shoulders after long journeys. They never saw her. Even when she set steaming water before them, they drank without thanks. At times there was a curt nod, never paired with a glance. Once she had tried to speak, to ask a question about the road, to stir some small conversation. But the man across from her had frowned, answered with indifference, then turned away. From then on, she stopped. Silence was easier than being cut short mid-sentence. Redstone was a small town. Everyone knew everything about everyone, except Naomi. They did not care to know, nor wanted to. In their stories, she was only a faint figure, useful enough for mockery before vanishing like smoke. And though her heart ached to be seen, to be heard, to be called by her true name, she accepted the truth. She was an invisible woman. Yet that winter night, when Colter Wade walked in from the storm, Naomi felt what it meant to be looked at, truly looked at, with no avoidance, no condescension. Just once, but enough to leave her shaken. She had lived as a blurred shadow in the lives of others. And yet, that night in the snow, a stranger spoke to her as if she were real. Naomi's hands still clutched at her dress as she remembered his words. In her small room, for the first time in years, she had spoken a truth aloud. I have never shared a bed with anyone. That whisper was not only for Colter. It was a confession to herself, a reminder of how she had lived, alone, quiet, unseen. And tonight, with another breath stirring the air of her room, Naomi knew her life would change. In what way? It was a thought she dared not yet imagine. Winter dawn in Redstone always came late. Light never rushed through the windows, but crept in little by little, pale as ash scattered over rooftops. That morning, Naomi Carter woke while the world outside was still thick with gray. The wind howled past the glass, carrying fine snow in restless swirls. In her modest wooden room, the fire in the stove had long since died, leaving only a few glowing coals, breathing out a thin, fragile warmth. Naomi sat up slowly, drawing the quilt close around her shoulders. The steady sound of breathing on the far side of the bed made her heart falter. All her life she had opened her eyes to absolute silence. But this morning, in the narrow space she called her own, that breath reminded her she had done something she never had before. Brought a stranger home. Let him rest upon the bed that had always been hers alone. She turned her head. Colter Wade, the man who had stepped into the inn through the storm, lay on his side, his face softened in quiet sleep. His heavy coat hung over the chair, now drying in faint patches, still carrying the sharp scent of cold wind. His dark hair, drenched the night before, lay tousled, a few strands fallen across his brow. Weariness lingered in his features, yet the depth of his sleep told its own story. The miles of snow had drained him to the bone. Naomi slipped from the bed, her bare feet meeting the chill of the boards. Wrapping herself in a faded wool scarf, she crouched by the stove, feeding it fresh logs. The fire snapped alive, casting new light across the man's sleeping face. She glanced once, then quickly turned away, afraid her gaze might linger too long. On the small table by the stove she set a clay pot, filled with ground corn and the salt she had been saving. Supper had gone untouched the night before. Now she would make a thin porridge, not for her own hunger, but for the stranger who had braved the storm. A man who had walked through snow and darkness surely needed something warm to steady him. She moved as though performing a daily chore, pouring water, stirring, sprinkling salt. Yet her hands betrayed her, clumsy, unsteady, for her mind kept asking why. Why should she care for a man whose name she had only just learned? Still, the spoon moved in circles, as if it did not want to stop. When the smell of porridge rose with the steam, Naomi crossed the room, lifting Colter's coat. It was still heavy with damp, icy against her skin. She shivered, then carried it to the fire, hanging it near the heat so it would dry bit by bit. A small gesture, but she carried it out with a carefulness as though she were tending to herself. The porridge was ready. Naomi ladled it into a clay bowl, the steam curling upward, blending with the smoke of the fire until the room itself seemed warmer. On the table she placed the bowl, beside it a scrap of paper and a worn-down pencil. Her hand trembled as she wrote, the crooked letters clear enough. Eat some porridge and rest. Leave only when your strength has returned. Setting down the pencil, Naomi's fingers shook. Never before had she left a note for a man. Yet now those few words seemed the only way to say what she could not bring herself to speak. She turned for one last look. Colter slept still, his breath even, his face calm in the glow of the fire. The bowl steamed quietly, the paper lying silent beside it. To anyone else it would be a plain scene, but to Naomi it was something she had never known. The presence of another life in her room, breaking the long dominion of solitude. She wrapped her scarf tighter, adjusted the curtain to keep the draft at bay, and without a word, without waking him, she opened the door. The cold wind struck her cheeks, sharp as glass. Snow lay thick across the steps. She pulled the scarf close and walked quickly toward the inn. Redstone streets at dawn were still hushed. A few figures shoveled snow from their doorways, the sound of horses carried faintly through the gray. Naomi moved swiftly, tucking herself into the wind. She did not wish to be seen. She did not want whispers rising if anyone caught sight of her leaving her house with a strange man inside. Back at the inn, she slipped into her routine, stoking the fire, wiping tables, checking sheets, as though nothing had changed in the night. Yet deep within, Naomi knew otherwise. For that morning, in her small room, she had left behind a steaming bowl of porridge, a crooked note, and a man still breathing in sleep. It was not love, nor a bond. It was a simple act of kindness. But to Naomi, kindness was a luxury seldom granted. And that morning, she had dared to give herself that luxury, dared to offer it to a stranger. That late afternoon, as Naomi Carter left the inn with a wicker basket on her arm, Redstone was already stirring. In small towns, news never needed a newspaper to spread. A single whisper could take root in a dozen ears, then swell into 100. By the time Naomi reached the marketplace, the main street was humming with talk. The maid from the inn took a cowboy to her bed. The words, with no clear origin, had become a chorus repeated at every corner. Naomi walked on, her head slightly bowed, the basket swinging from her arm. She felt the glances cutting her way, some half hidden behind curt nods, others brazen and unashamed. A shrill laugh rose from a group of women choosing corn, a drunkard's snicker carried openly from the saloon porch. Each sound clung like thorns, scratching at her chest with every step. At the fabric stall she often visited, the shopkeeper grew suddenly cold. When Naomi asked for needle and thread, the woman answered curtly, eyes fixed downward, lips bent in a sour twist. At the next booth, two women whispered just loud enough for Naomi to hear. "See? I told you. That colored girl never had a place here. A woman alone. What else could she be waiting for?" The other chuckled, hand raised to hide her mouth, but not her spite. Naomi tightened her grip on the basket handle and pressed on. Boots sinking into snow turned to mud. Her shoulders stiffened. Her head hung low, as though to shield herself from every gaze. At the saloon near the end of the street, a cluster of men sprawled against the porch rail, laughter spilling into the cold. One of them called out in a high, mocking voice, "Hey, look there! The inn maid finally learned how to keep a cowboy in her bed." The others roared, their laughter crude, merciless. Naomi did not turn her head. Her stride only quickened, the wind stinging her cheeks, though not nearly as sharp as the heat burning across them. Everywhere she passed, the story gathered more spice. Some said she lured men for the promise of shelter. Others swore they heard her laughter drifting from her small house. A few even claimed they had seen her lamp burning all night. Proof enough for their certainty. Naomi kept silent. She knew that if she reacted, it would only feed them. So she wore her stillness like armor, clutching the basket tight, eyes fixed ahead. Inside, though, every murmur cut like a dull knife, never sharp enough to kill, but cruel enough to bleed her bit by bit. She thought back to the night before, the quiet, fragile calm of her room. She had believed perhaps no one would know, but this town never missed its chance to turn an outcast into a spectacle. And now they had a story ripe for mockery. Not all the faces were cruel. Some watched in silence, eyes softer. Yet in Redstone, silence was as good as agreement. Naomi knew no one would defend her. No one wanted to be drawn into the affair of the colored maid from the inn. Her basket grew heavy in her arms as, though filled with stone instead of trifles, each step dragged through the muck, yet she kept moving. To stop would only give them more to laugh at. Leaving the market, she veered down a quieter road where fewer souls passed. The wind there sliced her skin raw, but at least it carried no scorn. She drew the bitter air deep into her lungs, hoping its sting might numb the ache inside. Naomi did not cry. She never allowed herself to cry under the weight of gossip. Tears in their eyes would only prove weakness, proof that the lies were true. So she swallowed them back, her white-knuckled grip on the basket the only sign of the storm inside. All she had done was set a bowl of porridge on the table, leave behind a note, then return quietly to her work. A simple kindness, nothing more. Yet through the town's eyes, it had twisted into mockery. Naomi's gaze lifted to the small house waiting at the end of the street. In her mind, she saw again Colter Wade's steady eyes as he set his hat down, the weight of his words still ringing. From this night on, you'll never have to sleep alone again. That vow had felt like a flame in a blizzard. But here in Redstone's market, under the jeers and whispers, that flame seemed buried, nearly smothered. Drawing a deep breath, Naomi quickened her steps up the final hill. She knew that tonight, alone in her room, every whisper would come back, gnawing at her in the dark. Yet she also knew that if she remembered the steady breath of Colter sleeping beside her, she might find just enough courage to go on. The snow had not ceased. For days on end, gray clouds pressed low over Redstone, the wind sweeping down the streets as though it meant to swallow every porch whole. In that bitter cold, Naomi had made her choice. Colter would remain in her small house a while longer. She knew the rumors outside were crackling like dry timber, every glance and mocking laugh pushing her toward the shadows. But for the first time, Naomi did not run. She quietly stoked the fire, dried Colter's coat by the hearth, and let the town say what it would. Colter showed no hurry. The wound along his shoulder needed time, and the weariness of long miles would not vanish overnight. He still walked to the square when needed, leading his horse to the well, tightening the worn leather of his saddle. But most hours he spent within Naomi's narrow home. His presence was simple, yet for her it was a wall against the storm. But in a town as small as Redstone, silence only made the fire spread higher. And there was one man who could not bear the sight of Naomi with another by her side. That afternoon, as the clouds rolled heavy overhead, Colter had just watered his horse at the public well and was making his way back toward the inn. His steps were steady, his manner unhurried, unconcerned by the stares clinging to him. Yet in a place where gossip ran swifter than snowmelt, a stranger tied to whispered scandal could never walk unnoticed. Naomi, bent over linens inside the inn, knew nothing of the scene gathering outside. Caleb Turner was waiting at the corner where the late light stretched long over dirty snow. Caleb, thick-set and rough from years of hauling crates, his square face always half-clouded by drink. For years he had worked beside Naomi, never daring to speak what festered inside, watching her with eyes equal parts hunger and resentment. When the rumor broke that Naomi had taken a strange cowboy to her bed, the jealousy in him burned wild. He thought nothing of truth, nothing of Naomi's dignity. In his mind was only one fact. She had been taken, and he, the one who had waited in silence, had been made a fool. As Colter drew near, Caleb stepped from the shadow, planting himself in the way. His voice rose, hoarse and venomous. "Cowboy, who the hell do you think you are, laying hands on her?" Colter stopped, gray eyes lowering to the man who stood half a head shorter. He said nothing at first, only set his hat more firmly in hand, the wind tugging at his coat. The silence only fed Caleb's rage. He stepped closer, finger jabbing at Colter's chest. "Her, Naomi. She's not the kind of woman for you to use and toss aside. But maybe she is that kind. One night and she let you into her house, her bed. Do you even know how many in Redstone are laughing at her now?" Every word dripped with poison, aimed not just at Colter, but at Naomi's very name. A handful of townsfolk paused nearby, eyes keen, waiting for the show. In a place like Redstone, personal quarrel was sport enough. Colter did not flinch, did not back down. He set his hat on a crate beside him, then lifted his gaze, steel flashing in the winter dusk. His voice, low and rough, cut clear through the air. "Naomi never wanted you." Caleb faltered for a breath, then barked out a bitter laugh, as if the words were jest. Colter's voice pressed on, firm, measured, leaving no space for doubt. And she never belonged to your rumors. If you've got any pride left, you'll leave her be. The square fell still. The crowd had not expected such words, blunt and unyielding, but in their plainness lay a strike heavier than any fist. All of Redstone knew Caleb had lingered after Naomi like a shadow, though she had never once returned his look. And now, before every watching eye, that truth was laid bare by a stranger. Caleb's face flushed red, his fists clenched, eyes burning wild. Yet Colter stood rooted, broad shoulders steady, gaze unshaken. That composure enraged Caleb further. It showed him plainly how little he mattered. He stepped forward again, the reek of whiskey hot in the air. His growl rose between clenched teeth. You think you're someone? You're nothing but a ragged cowboy. Here today, gone tomorrow. I've been here in Redstone. I know Naomi better than you ever will. Colter's mouth curved, not into a smile but a cold twist at the corner, disdain plain in his tone. You don't know a thing. The only thing you need to know is that from now on, Naomi won't hear another word from you. Silence fell once more. Caleb trembled with rage, but the eyes around them had shifted. A few nodded quietly. Others smirked at the spectacle. In a town that thrived on gossip, this was theater. The brooding laborer cut down by a stranger's steel voice. Caleb swallowed hard, turned on his heel. Yet before he left, he spat one last threat through clenched teeth. Watch yourself, cowboy. I won't forget this. His boots ground into the frozen snow, each step echoing sharp and heavy. Colter stood where he was, calm as stone. He lifted his hat, set it back on his head, and walked away without so much as a glance at the onlookers. But at the inn's window, Naomi had seen it all. She stood behind the worn curtain, dark eyes brimming. Colter's words struck her chest like a bell. All her years in Redstone, no one had ever stood for her, never spoken against the jeers. Every slight, every whisper she had swallowed in silence. Yet here, a man, just a stranger days ago, had spoken aloud before the town that she did not belong to their lies. Naomi pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling the sob. Not from shame, but from something she had never known. The shock of being defended, of being named and seen. Outside, Colter's tall frame moved steady down the street, boot prints cutting dark into the snow. To Naomi, that image etched itself deeper than all the whispers Redstone could muster. The town carried, on as always, horses clattering, merchants shouting, wind carving its way through the alleys. But for Naomi Carter, that afternoon would never be like any other. That night, Redstone lay under a strange hush. After the heavy winds of the afternoon, the town had shrunk into itself beneath a thick quilt of snow. Roof eaves sagged under the weight. The street lamps flickered weakly, casting a dim yellow haze over the frozen road. In the small house at the edge of town, Naomi Carter fed more wood to the fire, the crackle of burning logs pushing back the chill seeping through the cracks. Colter Wade returned after a long day scouring the hills for signs of the bandits who had stolen his cargo. His coat was stiff with frost, one shoulder ripped where a branch had torn through the fabric. He pulled off his gloves, laid his gun on the table, and unfastened the ties of his cloak. Naomi had just turned to fetch another pot of water when she heard it. A soft sound, faint, like something slipping to the wooden floor. She looked up. Near the leg of the table, A small brown cloth pouch had tumbled from the ragged edge of his coat. It was not large, but what caught her eye was the fine embroidery glinting in gold thread, shining against the firelight. The stitching was not the work of rough country hands. It was neat, precise, the kind of craft that spoke of an Eastern artisan's touch. Naomi hesitated before bending down, her slender fingers trembling as they touched it. The pouch was light. Yet when she loosened the ties, what slid into her palm was not a handful of coins. A square of fine silk fell, whispering as it landed on the floorboards. At once the firelight caught on its sheen, throwing back a glow Naomi had never seen. She stood still. Her fingertips brushed the surface, cool, smooth, almost dissolving beneath her touch. In Redstone, people wore wool, buckskin, and coarse cotton at best. Silk this fine, was a luxury belonging only to wealthy merchants or the well-born. Naomi lifted her gaze, confusion clouding her dark eyes. This, her voice broke, barely more than a whisper. Colter, still seated and tugging off his soaked boots, stopped. His gray eyes slid toward her, fixing on the strip of silk in her hands. For a moment, the room was heavy with silence. The fire cracked, shadows of their figures dancing jagged across the wall. He drew a slow breath, then rose to his feet. Moving toward her, Colter extended his hand, not snatching, but deliberate, as if surrendering to the discovery. "You weren't meant to see that," he said quietly, voice rough and low. Naomi stepped back, clutching the silk tighter. Her eyes shone with both fear and bewilderment. In her mind, the image of Colter, the weary traveler, the penniless cowboy begging for shelter in a snowstorm, split apart, fractured into something she could not name. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice shook, soft but clear. The fire in the stove flared and dimmed, throwing Colter's shadow high on the wall, jagged and incomplete, like a painting unfinished. He sat down in the chair, his roughened hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze swallowed by the flames. A heavy silence filled the room before his voice broke it, slow, low, and steady. "I am not the penniless drifter you believed me to be. I am a merchant of cloth. I come from Laramie, and this journey was meant to find a source of linen here in Redstone and to widen my trade routes." Naomi stood frozen near the narrow window. She heard the words, each of them clear, yet her mind lagged, unable to seize their weight. The man who had stepped into her shabby house, slept on her creaking bed, was no beggar cowboy. He was a merchant, wealthy, powerful, carrying in his hands the kind of value she had never touched. Colter lowered his head, his fingers curling, then loosening again, as though searching for the right shape of truth. But on the road from Laramie, I was ambushed. They had tracked me for days, waiting for the loneliest stretch. They took everything, wagons, money, even the team of horses. I escaped with only what scraps of cloth I could gather, rolling down an embankment and fleeing into the trees. I barely lived to tell it. His voice was even, without embellishment, but the blunt honesty made Naomi shiver. The man she thought she knew, dust-stained, weary, boot-worn, now overlapped with another image, a merchant presiding over wagons of silk, striking bargains in the great markets of the East, shaking hands with men of wealth. Naomi gripped the hem of her dress, her throat tight. Everything in her small room suddenly seemed out of place. The scarred wooden table, the chipped kettle, the patchwork quilt. Too poor, too fragile to stand beside the man before her. You are a wealthy merchant?" Her voice was faint, half disbelief, half question. Colter lifted his eyes, gray meeting her deep brown. He did not look away, did not soften the truth, only let her see it plain. Yes, I once had more than what you see now, but at this moment, I have only these hands and the little cloth you found. Naomi stood speechless. The man who had eaten her thin porridge, worn a tattered coat she dried by the fire, slept under her patched quilt. He was not poor. He was a man who once traded goods worth enough to feed the whole of Redstone for months. A strange tide rose in her, part shame, part awe. All her life she had watched men of wealth from a distance, in their fine coats, their polished hats, their purebred horses. They had never stooped to see her, a colored maid at the inn, her hands cracked from washing, her back bent under whispers. Yet tonight, one such man sat in her house, laying bare his greatest secret. Naomi turned aside, unable to endure his steady gaze. In the dim mirror hanging by the wall, she saw herself reflected, hair braided in haste, face darkened by the sun, hands scarred by endless work. A poor shadow beside the gleam of silk still marked by her touch. Colter's silence stretched. Then he spoke again, his voice low but certain. I did not speak of it because I did not know who I could trust in Redstone. The trade road is filled with danger. But now that you've seen it, I can hide no more. Naomi turned back, her eyes troubled, her voice trembling. Why me? You don't know me at all. Colter looked straight at her, unblinking. I know enough. I know you are not like the rest, those who live by rumor. You may live quietly, despised, unseen, but you do not lie. And to me, that is worth more than gold. The words fell heavy, cutting deep. Naomi's chest tightened. All her life she had borne the weight of scorn. Easy, unworthy, outcast. Never once had anyone told her that her silence carried honor. Never once had someone seen in her hardness a truth unbroken. For a heartbeat she did not know whether to weep or to laugh. All the walls she had built, believing him only a wanderer, believing herself fated to remain unseen, crumbled in that moment. Before her stood a man far more complex, far richer, and bearing wounds deeper than she had guessed. The fire snapped, casting his face in stark relief, tired yet resolute. Naomi sat at the edge of the bed, fingers locked together, struggling for words. But before she could speak, she felt it already, the certainty that from the instant he confessed, her life would never return to what it had been. Outside, the wind cut through the boards, snow falling thick again. Inside, a truth had been unsealed, and Naomi Colter sat with her heart racing, seeing the man in her house not as a passing traveler, but as a wealthy merchant bound to a secret powerful enough to alter both their fates. Night settled heavy over Redstone, blanketing the town like a shroud. Snow weighed thick on the rooftops, the wind howling through every crack, making timbers groan. The oil lamp outside the saloon flickered in the cold, casting weak, uneven light over the frozen street. Naomi Colter was no stranger to such bleak silence, but tonight the stillness carried a foreboding chill. In her small house, Naomi sat by the fire, hands cupped around a steaming bowl of broth. Colter Wade sat opposite, his gray eyes brooding into the flames. Since the night he confessed who he truly was, the air between them had shifted. Naomi had not yet grown accustomed to the thought that the man who ate her thin porridge had once been a wealthy merchant. But what troubled her more was the secret itself. If it slipped beyond these walls, would it bring ruin down upon them both? The answer came swifter than she feared. Hooves thundered at the far end of the street, shattering the winter hush. Naomi stiffened, her fingers locked around the bowl. Colter rose in an instant, eyes sharp, alert. He knew the sound. Not late travelers, not patrols. This was many horses, moving in unison, loud and deliberate. Moments later came the shouts, coarse and jeering. Across the way, the inn's front door splintered under a boot, furniture crashing in the night. Naomi froze, her heart tightening. The bandits. They had come to Redstone. Colter strode to the window, lifting the worn curtain. One glance, then he stepped back, jaw clenched. "It's them," he muttered. Naomi followed on instinct. In the wavering light outside, she saw them. Broad-shouldered men masked in cloth, guns and knives flashing. They tore through doors, bellowing for the goods that remained. The townsfolk cowered in darkness, no one daring to rise. Colter turned, voice low, grim. "They've come for me." Naomi's knees weakened. The world seemed to collapse in the space of a heartbeat. And then the sound came, boots pounding closer, straight toward her door. The latch burst, and among the bandits stood a face she knew. Caleb Turner, the man who had worked beside her at the inn, who had watched her with those uneasy eyes, half hunger, half restraint, now stood tall, chest puffed, eager to prove himself among wolves. Naomi went cold. It was not only fear that pierced her, but a deeper wound. Betrayal. This was the man who had once carried heavy sacks for her, who had shared small, awkward words by the coal stove. And now his voice rang with triumph, pointing straight to her home. "He's here. Colter Wade, the man with silk still hidden. I told you, he's holed up with the colored girl. Right here." The bandits roared with laughter, raucous and cruel, surging toward the steps. Naomi shrank back, fingers clutching her dress, her body trembling. She could not comprehend it. Caleb as the traitor. For years he had been coarse, yes, and his looks had made her uneasy, but she had still thought of him as a fellow worker, someone safe enough in the shadows of shared labor. Never had she imagined he would be the one to deliver her into ruin. Colter stepped forward, tall as a wall, shielding her with his frame. His hand drew his revolver, gray eyes fixed on the men outside. The room thickened, air heavy, ready to shatter. Caleb moved closer, his voice biting, eager for the bandits' approval. "He's got nothing left but scraps of cloth. But they're worth something. I've seen them. And the woman, she's hiding him. Brought him to her bed that very night." Naomi's breath caught. In that instant, the truth struck hard. Caleb had never cared for her. What he called feeling had only been possession, and when denied, he would gladly destroy her to gain favor elsewhere. Outside, the wind carried the bandits' guttural laughter, swirling through the cracks. Inside, Naomi stood behind Colter, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears, her fear bound tight with something sharper, pain, deep and raw. The pain of betrayal from a man she had once thought harmless, if not kind. Caleb was no longer the silent coworker who swept floors beside her. He was the traitor, and Naomi knew that stain would never fade from her memory. Boots pounded against the wooden floor, shaking the small house to its frame. The bandits surged inside, their shadows leaping wild against the fire's glow. Knives flashed, gun barrels gleamed, catching cold sparks of light. The narrow room seemed to choke itself, the very air stripped away. Naomi shrank back by instinct, hands clutching her dress, heart racing hard against her ribs. Every exit was blocked. Colter stepped forward at once, broad shoulders filling the space before her. His stance was steady, hands poised at the holsters, his gray eyes sharp as ice. "Hand over the rest of the goods," one of the outlaws barked, his voice low and rasping, his eyes narrowed with threat. "We know you've kept something. Give it up, and maybe you keep your life." Colter's mouth curved, but no answer came. The silence stretched, taut as wire, broken only by the wind hissing through the cracks. Naomi saw his shoulders tighten and knew, if a shot rang out, no one would leave unscathed. From behind them, Caleb laughed, harsh and triumphant. "I told you, he's hiding cloth. The whole town knows he's been skulking behind this woman. Tonight, it ends." The words stabbed Naomi deeper than any blade. She wanted to speak, to deny it, but her throat was raw, the sound locked inside her. One bandit stepped close, gun leveled straight at Colter's chest. For a heartbeat, Naomi believed it was over, that the fire would gut her out, and her name would be buried with a death too small to matter. Then her eyes caught the oil lamp on the table. Its little flame flickered, a fragile spark fighting the dark. Before thought could stop her, Naomi lunged. Her hands closed on the hot glass, heat searing her skin. In one swift motion, under the startled eyes of every man, she hurled it down. The lamp burst across the floorboards. Oil spread, fire roared upward in a wave. The room exploded in orange light, flames painting every face in terror. The bandits shouted, stumbling, clawing at each other for a way out. Black smoke churned upward, the stench of burning oil choking the air. Naomi fell back to the wall, clutching her chest, breath ragged. She had never dreamed she could do such a thing, yet the fire had burned away her fear, leaving behind only a desperate strength. Colter seized the moment. He kicked a table aside, revolver gleaming in the blaze. Gunshots cracked, splintering wood, driving the outlaws back. Through the smoke his figure loomed, swift, unyielding, every movement sure and hard. Caleb stumbled, panic twisting his face as he tried to flee. But it was too late. Townsfolk, roused by the chaos, had gathered outside. They caught him on the steps, bound his arms as he spat and cursed, his protests lost in the storm of noise. The remaining outlaws, faced with fire and fury, broke and ran into the night, leaving the little house blazing, smoke curling into the snow-filled sky. Naomi sank to her knees, hands trembling against her lap, her breath jagged. Her whole body quivered from the shock. But when she lifted her gaze, she saw Colter standing amidst the ruin, his tall frame etched against the firelight. He turned, and in his eyes she found a certainty she had never known. The flames began to die, but their echo lingered. The people of Redstone stood round, wide-eyed, unable to believe what they had seen. Naomi, the woman long dismissed, the colored maid of the inn, had hurled the lamp that lit the blaze, forcing the outlaws to scatter. A whisper spread among them. A man muttered, She stood against them?" A woman clutched her shawl tighter, staring at Naomi as if seeing her for the first time. Naomi lowered her head, unable to meet their eyes. Yet inside another fire burned, one not born of oil or flame, but of the truth that for the first time in her life, she had risen. No longer a shadow hiding behind rumor. Colter stepped to her side, his hand reaching to lift her up. His gaze, calm yet fierce, spoke more than words. Naomi let her hand rest in his, warmth steadying her tremble. Outside, the snow kept falling, covering the footprints of chaos. But in the eyes of Redstone, the mark of this night would never fade. From this moment on, Naomi Colter would no longer be invisible. The morning after, Redstone woke as if from a nightmare. Traces of the night's chaos lay scattered still, splintered boards in the street, black scorch marks smeared across the inn's doorway, windows shattered and patched with cloth. Yet the main street was more crowded than ever. The townsfolk had gathered, not only to trade as usual, but to murmur about what had happened in the dark. In the thick of the crowd walked Naomi Colter. A cotton shawl wrapped her shoulders, her eyes lowered. Each step felt heavier than the last. All her life she had moved through this market beneath cold stares, beneath whispers sharp with scorn. But today, the silence was different. No mocking laughter trailed her. Instead, there was a restless hum, half curious, half uneasy. Beside her walked Colter Wade. He did not shrink back, nor did he shield her from the eyes. His hand closed around hers, firm, steady, warm. It spread through her like the firelight on a winter night, enough to quiet the tremor in her steps. The crowd parted as Colter stopped at the small square where the market stalls circled wide. Dozens of eyes turned, full of judgment, of surprise. Naomi felt them sweep over her, some sharp, some doubtful, some wide with disbelief. Colter gave them no heed. He set his hat aside, let the cold wind rake through his dark hair. Then he tightened his grip on Naomi's hand, stepped forward, and spoke. His voice rang deep, clear, unyielding. "She is no one's jest. She is the woman I choose." The words rolled out, breaking over the square. For a heartbeat, the market froze. All the murmurs, all the gossip, all the whispering ground to silence. Naomi's heart clenched. The statement was plain, without flourish, yet spoken before every gaze. It weighed heavier than iron. The pause stretched, wind threading between wooden storefronts, carrying the scents of leather and cornmeal. Naomi's eyes swept the crowd, the old woman who had once turned her away with disdain, the man who muttered insults each time she passed, the women who had hidden their cruel laughter behind hands. All of them stood quiet now, their eyes lowered or turned aside. Colter laid his other hand gently on Naomi's shoulder, his voice rising stronger, meant for every ear. "From the night I walked into her house, I knew that was where I belonged. She is not an outcast, and I will not stand by while anyone calls her less than she is." Naomi trembled. The hand in his burned hot, her chest pounding as though it might break. She had lived her life enduring in silence, ducking every look. But now, before them all, Colter had raised her up, not as a shadow behind him, but as his equal at his side. From the back of the crowd, whispers stirred. A man muttered, "Her? She's the one he claims?" Another voice snapped, "Impossible!" But as Colter's hand tightened around hers, the whispers faltered, thinning into uneasy quiet. Naomi lifted her head, her brown eyes glistening for the first time. She did not turn away from the stairs. She met them, steady, showing the town who she was, not the colored girl from the inn, but Naomi Colter, called by her true name, chosen openly. Faces shifted. Some dropped their gaze in shame. Others drew in breath, then looked away, unable to hold her eyes. That silence spoke louder than 100 taunts. For Naomi knew, from this day, they would never look at her the same again. Colter leaned close, whispering for her alone, You will never have to stand alone again." Naomi swallowed hard, tears spilling, but not tears of humiliation. They were tears of release, of being seen, of being called, of being chosen. The morning wind swept through the square, the snow melting into bright rivulets along the rooftops. And there, in the heart of Redstone's market, Naomi Colter was no longer the shadow who passed unseen. Colter Wade's voice still echoed across the market square, carried on the wind that swept under the eaves and over the hoofbeats fading down the main street. The crowd had barely drawn breath after his bold words, "She is the woman I choose," when he stepped forward again, his hand tightening on Naomi's, his voice ringing clear. "I will open a new cloth shop here in Redstone. And Naomi Colter, the girl you once scorned, will be the one who stands beside me." A wave of murmurs rose at once. Faces turned to each other, lips moving, but no one dared raise a voice. In their eyes flickered disbelief, unease. They had always seen Naomi as a shadow, a servant, a colored maid not worth a name. And now she was named as an equal, declared openly before the town. Naomi stood still as stone. Her ears roared, the whispers blurring, until only one phrase remained, echoing in her mind. "The one who stands beside me. Not ward, not burden, but companion." Her name had been spoken, not as mockery, but wrapped in pride. Her vision blurred with tears. She turned to Colter. He stood unbending, gray eyes sharp, unshaken beneath every stare. His grip on her hand was iron, as though carving the vow into her very flesh. Naomi trembled, whispering so low only he could hear, "All my life, I have never shared a bed with anyone." The words escaped like a final breath after years of silence. Simple, but heavy with a lifetime of solitude, of shrinking back from the world's cruel tongues. Colter bowed his head, eyes locking with hers, unyielding and yet gentle. His reply came slow, but every syllable struck deep. "From this day you will never sleep alone again. This is our home." The words fell not only for Naomi, but for Redstone itself, and the silence that followed proved all had heard. Naomi's lips quivered, her chest tight with a sob. His hand enfolded hers, warmth seeping into her cold fingers. In his gaze she saw no pity, no bargain, only a promise as solid as earth, as steadfast as a roof in the storm. Outside, the snow still fell, layering rooftops, burying streets. But in Naomi's heart, the long winter of her life was over. Not because the snow had ceased, but because, at last, someone stood beside her, ready to build a true home. The crowd began to disperse. Some turned away in shame, some shook their heads, some eyes lingered, curious, softened, or begrudging with respect. Rumors would linger, Naomi knew, but they would never sound the same. From this day, the name Naomi Colter no longer meant the colored maid at the inn. It was bound now to a public choice, to a new shop, to a promise forged beneath falling snow. Naomi drew a deep breath, the air sharp and clean in her lungs. Her heart still trembled, but not with fear. It was the tremor of stepping into light for the first time, of knowing she was no longer cast aside. Colter's hand held fast as he led her slow across the market square, through every stair. Each step they left in the snow gleamed like a witness to a new beginning. Naomi lifted her face. Among the whitened rooftops of the main street, she no longer felt small. At her side was the man, merchant or wanderer, past unknown, who had opened the door to a home. And for Naomi, that was enough to end every winter. Beneath the snow's white cover, their story closed not with a vow alone, but with a home built of trust and courage. From the girl once despised, Naomi had stepped out of the shadows, her hand held before the town by a man who spoke her name with honor. And Colter, after miles of loss and wandering, had found his harbor, not in wealth nor trade, but in a heart that had waited and dared to share. Perhaps we who have lived through many winters know this truth well. Happiness is not found in riches, nor in the world's applause. It lies in a hand clasping another, in a hearth where no heart must tremble alone. If this story has touched you, dear friends, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to like and subscribe so we may continue to share more Wild West love stories, where love finds a way to take root even in the coldest storms.